Hello, everyone, and welcome to what is the first episode of Frontline Interviews. And I am really pleased to be introducing Alison Taylor, Director of Energy and Extractives at BSR, Business for Social Responsibility. And it's very appropriate that Alison is my first guest because Alison first came to my attention through a blog piece that she wrote for Forbes. It was about a year ago.
Oh, is that all?
Yeah, called Compliance and Risk, Clearing the Org Chart Hurdle. And that's when I said, here is another voice that's looking at compliance and anti-bribery issues holistically as more than just, as you say, the bolt-on set of rules and procedures. And through the wonders of social media, it wasn't long till we made a connection and had a coffee. And before you know it, we were writing a piece for Ethical Boardroom called Reconciling Sales Strategy with FCPA Compliance. And we also authored a few other pieces together. And here we are. Now, Alison, you started your career, or early in your career, as the Director of Middle East and Africa for Corporate Investigations for Control Risk, and then Program Director for Transparency International. Back to Control Risk as their Senior Managing Director for the Americas. And then here we are at BSR. So talk to me a little bit about that trajectory.
Well, thanks for having me, Richard. I spent a long time in investigations, primarily due diligence, market intelligence, and then increasingly as anti-corruption ideas and law enforcement got momentum in looking at how companies respond to corruption risks. So very in the weeds there for a very long time with a heavy focus on emerging markets. And as I started to look more at compliance and anti-corruption systems, I was just rather struck by the fact that there was very little resemblance between what I saw going on in companies day to day and going on particularly in higher risk markets and what corporate programs were saying. And there seemed to be a disconnect. And the focus of the disconnect, I think, if we're going to nail it very briefly, is human behavior. So how humans really think and act and behave and what motivates them, I think, until recently, has been rather absent from conversations about compliance systems. So I have approached this problem from various angles in various roles. I've ended up working in sustainability and social responsibility because I think that's where the compliance conversation needs to go, but we can get into that.
Okay. Well, that brings us to your MA in Organizational Psychology at Columbia Teachers College, I believe.
That's right.
And what was your master's thesis on?
So organizational psychology is it's the study of how humans behave, and obviously given my background in corruption, I thought it would be a good idea to look at organizational psychology and how it might apply to corruption. So I became very interested in the idea of organizational culture, which people talk about all the time. There was an article in the New York Times about a week ago about the culture at Amazon and everyone's been talking about it. So people find this subject of huge interest. They're very, very instinctive about it. But then when you look at the advice people are given about compliance systems, it's all about policies and procedures and training and tone at the top.
Right.
And there's a whole sort of system there. But people don't really get into the conversation about what an anti-corruption culture would look like. And the phrase is used, a culture of compliance. But when you think about what that actually means, I wouldn't say it's meaningless, but it's a very, very difficult concept to nail down. So I decided to try and get to the bottom of what we mean by a culture of compliance and a culture of corruption.
Well, let's take a deep dive, and excuse the iPad, but I had the pleasure of reading your abstract and I took some notes. So you talk about anti-corruption programs as not working. High level, what does that mean to you?
Well, I think what I mean by that is that a system, a process, any sort of process to check, say what expenses are being paid, or have you done your due diligence, or has this employee done their training, those sort of systems, which are a huge multi-million-dollar industry, make no sense in a vacuum. So going back to this idea of a culture of compliance, what we mean is a culture where people do what they're told.
Right.
Well, why are you being told to do that? Who is telling you to do that? And does it make any sense in comparison with what else you're being told?
Okay. So you talk about, and I think you're speaking sort of a tick box approach to compliance. So if you talk about that being inadequate, but what's the substitute?
I don't think it's a case of a substitute, because I don't think what I'm saying is that compliance is unnecessary, let's all get rid of the compliance department.
Right,
what the compliance department does is not valuable, and so I wouldn't want that to be the message. But the point is that compliance...
And I think you used the word essential, but not working.
Exactly.
Right.
So compliance teams sit within an organisation. They have a certain position in the organisation. The head of compliance may be more or less powerful than the head of sales, just as an example. So compliance teams set the rules and are responsible for the rules, and sometimes personally legally liable for implementing the rules, but the rules sit within a wider system that is based on the environment the company is operating in, the leadership, the culture, the incentives, the norms, what the company is trying to do. So to take a very obvious example, which we've written about a lot, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to say, go and be a salesperson in Nigeria, make sure you don't pay any bribes, but at the same time grow your business by 40% when everyone else is growing at 20%.
That's right.
So the wider goals, focus, purpose, values of the organization, you've got to think about those if you're going to think about whether the compliance system is going to work.
I think we've talked about that, how in the case that you just brought up, it's almost like the business strategy itself is a red flag for future corruption.
Yeah, exactly. So if you're going to look at what a corrupt culture looks like, and we think about Enron or Siemens or Petrobras, and kind of try and describe that, basically that was what my work was about. I did a lot of interviews with anti-corruption experts, people that have observed a lot of corruption. I said, how do people behave in a corrupt culture? What's really going on? And some very, very clear themes came out, and a sense of urgency and necessity, high goals that people can't reasonably meet, a lack of transparency, problems with reporting, concerns upwards, and so on. So a lot of things that don't have to do with compliance, but have a lot to do with how the wider company behaves and operates.
Understood. So in that sense, compliance is almost siloed from the rest of the organization.
Yeah, well, if compliance is siloed from the rest of the organisation, then it won't be effective.
Right.
And I've seen that over and over again, that compliance teams may have a lot of budget, they may even have a seat on the executive committee. But if they are not respected and not listened to by the strategy department and the board of directors and whoever is setting the incentives, there's only so much they can do. So I think very often compliance teams are being put in an impossible position of being expected to enforce rules that don't make any sense in the context of how people are otherwise being told to behave.
Right, so it's not aligning at the front line, so to speak.
Yeah, and the other thing is rules, like what the policy is on something is not generally what you think about first.
Right.
You look around at what the people in your office are doing, what time they go to lunch, what time they come in, what time they leave, what your boss does, and you take the cues of how you should behave from those things, from your team, your culture, your subculture. And only then do you look at what the actual procedure is. And that's the reality. And I think people have slightly lost sight of that with kind of trying to roll out these enormous compliance programs and boil the ocean and take this very, very comprehensive approach, which is lucrative for the advisors. But is it actually helping anyone, and is it actually tackling corruption? Not if you don't consider the wider context and values of the organisation.
I think our mutual friend Dr. Miles calls that the what actually happens in an
Exactly.
organization. Well, you talk about the emphasis on detecting individual propensities for fraud and corruption and the use of surveillance software systems as an example. Alison, you have a very broad experience from control risk to TI, not to BSR. I mean, based on your perspective, can compliance be automated, and what do you see as some of the benefits and drawbacks of automation?
Well, I think the compliance challenge has got so large that large organisations have to have a certain amount of automation just for practical reasons. But I mean, I can't keep sort of saying this enough. Processes are part of a larger system. They are easy to manipulate, and you just have to look at the real world. I mean, if processes and lawyers were the solution, we probably wouldn't have had the financial crisis. Right. The problem is not the rules, it's the cues people are getting about whether they're able to break the rules or not. So any process is only as strong as the culture and the system around it.
Understood. Well, you talk about the resources and the organizational mandate to build, let's say if you had to build an international division, what would your culture of compliance look like? Ground up.
That's a great question. I think I would be I'm very, very focused on understanding the market context. I'd be very, very focused on who else is in the market, what is the competition like, what are my stakeholders like, how transparent is it, how competitive are my products, do I have good quality, can I resist bribe payments because my product is so good and that country wants me in the market so much that I can afford delays, sure. Or am I effectively fighting a losing battle? So I think you have to consider the external environment. You have to consider who you then put in that remote location. There are advantages to expats. There are advantages to local employees. There are advantages to strong oversight from the centre. There are advantages to having strong leadership locally. Everything has got checks and balances and trade-offs there. But I think what doesn't work is translating a load of rules and expecting people to follow them and for them to be relevant. We've got to look at what the business is trying to achieve in that market and how that's being done. And then I think we've got to set up channels of communication and really focus on transparency and bottom-up transparency, which is, if you ask most companies, they'll say, oh yeah, we're transparent, we have great values. But very often there are strong hidden, buried incentives to say, don't tell me about these problems, I don't want to know, just get on with it.
Right.
If you're not meeting those targets, it's clearly because you're not a very good salesperson, not because the pressures are unrealistic.
No matter what sort of compliance paperwork or training you may have had.
Yeah, exactly. If the paperwork is meaningless, if the incentives themselves don't make sense.
Yeah, and we'll talk more about that. In fact, in your paper, you have a number of variables that you identify as organizational challenges, and you say where these exist, you have a stronger prediction that the organization is vulnerable. So let's look at a few. The ends justify the means, as you call the growth fetish, right? So let's look at frontier markets where we have growth and corruption are in abundance, right? Frontier markets. We see a decline in commodity prices and the slowdown in traditional market growth. So companies are going to look at these frontier markets to make up for revenue shortfall, and they're going to see those as the greatest growth areas. And there's been a lot of reporting about that lately. So where you have this corruption risk and growth potential in such abundance, what's a company to do in such markets?
I think to be very realistic about how they're there and whether they can be there and maintain their corporate values and maintain, a realistic expectation of what can be achieved in that market and to really try and understand that market. I mean, these are very complicated questions because if we follow the corruption dialogue, to its logical conclusion, we might start saying, well, there are certain markets that you can't be in without
Right.
paying bribes. There are certain markets that you can't stay in as an ethical company. And there, I think you have to start looking at opportunities for collective action and collaboration, and for companies working together, maybe to tackle things like the customs enforcement environment, or police, just the kind of basic conditions on the ground. But there are a lot of problems that are very, very intractable that even the best, most competitive company in the world can't solve on their own.
So I think in your Forbes piece, you talked about having a clear-eyed view of the risks that exist in these markets before you commit resources, before you send employees to travel there.
Yeah, absolutely. And then thinking about who you send and what backup and support they have, thinking about where you put the compliance officers. Do you put them locally? Do you put them in headquarters? Again, there are pros and cons to either. But I think the biggest red flag, and I keep going back to this, but it's so often overlooked, it's staggering, is the setting of unrealistic expectations and unrealistic incentives. And if you do that, you are going to have a very big problem enforcing even the best compliance regime.
Right. And I think our also mutual friend Scott Killingsworth talks about escalating commitment, that once you've got your employees in country, once you've dedicated resources to growing the market, then it becomes, well, we're already here. What do we need to do?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of how corruption occurs is really about an absence of thought and decision making, and so on. It doesn't have to be a nefarious intent, but it can just be, as simple as the outcome of what happens when you put people in remote locations on their own, with no support, no sense checks, unrealistic targets, a lot of pressure and a lot of competition. And so I think it's you can look at the pressures that might occur. You may not be able to predict exactly where corruption is going to happen, but that sort of setup is a perfect storm for corruption, really.
And do you see that perfect storm rising as we now see, especially in commodity markets, which you're very familiar with, we have a reduction in price per unit, where now we're hearing of compliance budgets being cut, travel, only essential travel being allowed. So at a time when maybe risks are rising in terms of frontline performance, like we need to make up these revenue shortfalls, and at the same time less oversight, training, and supervision, is that just a hypothetical risk, or do you see that as potentially endangering what's already a difficult situation?
I think that is a very plausible risk, that what are perceived to be the nice to have, such as deep dive due diligence and market intelligence, might get cut. I think you probably are seeing more operational scrutiny and cost cutting, which may lead to nasty stuff coming out of the woodwork. I think you tend to see fraud investigations rising in a recession. Right. But I do think companies are under pressure. They're under pressure to grow. They're under pressure to compete in a falling market. That increases, and that increases corruption risk.
Understood. You and another one of your subjects, and this we talked about before, is leaders' focus is selectively blind for plausible deniability. And you state, Alison, a lack of engagement with business conditions on the front line allows leaders to plausibly deny knowledge of corrupt activities. So, Alison, do you see this as a function of a matrix or a complex organization where there's just too much distance between the home office and the front lines? Or do you see that as a more deliberate effort by business leaders to not to know or not want to know those realities?
I think it can be both.
Okay.
I think a lot of the time you do have leadership that doesn't want to hear it because then they're going to deal with it, and it's a sort of implicit pressure of, don't complain, don't tell me you're having problems making your targets, stop thinking of another reason why you didn't make them, which may not be a deliberate avoidance of corruption, but it is creating a disincentive for people to raise problems that the organization needs to know about in order to tackle them. However, I think there is something about the matrixed organization and the lack of ownership and accountability where everybody is keen just to make sure that they've answered their particular chunk of the problem, people can make a series of decisions that look ethically neutral, but that add up to widespread harm.
In their own silo.
Exactly, in their own silo. And if there's shared responsibility and the buck doesn't stop with you, then you can end up with a situation where it's the Swiss cheese theory, the holes go through and things can go wrong.
Understood. Well, in another section, you talk about excessive local autonomy can lead to corrupt subcultures. I think of this as the remote office dynamic. So from your experience, would you reflect that the further away from the C-suite, the higher the degree of autonomy? So in other words, a regional manager in the Middle East might have more autonomy and discretion than his or her peer who's handling a U.S. market for a U.S.-based multinational. And, speaking theoretically, do you think that this increase in operating discretion and less supervision in these remote locations is bringing additional risk?
Yes, I do. And I think it sort of speaks to a need to look at power relationships and power structures, because people talk a lot about tone at the top. I think tone at the top is a very, very valid concept. People model what the leader is doing. If they see the leader getting away with it, they either think that person's too powerful to touch, or I can get away with it as well. So the leadership sets the tone and sets the culture. But where the relevant leadership is the question. So if you are your theoretical person in the US, and we have to look at the risk of that team to corruption, maybe we do need to look at the C-suite. They're closer to the C-suite. But the further we get to head office, the relevant top that we need to look at the tone from is the local management. Right. And I think what we found, what I found in this study is there's a sort of archetype. An archetypal corrupt culture is someone with a very, very directive, controlling leader, but far away from oversight of head office, and a very, very strong team culture, a lot of loyalty, a lot of disincentives to report problems to the outside, combined with this competitive pressure and incentives that we've already talked about.
That's that cocoon of corruption we've read about.
Yeah, exactly. And I think human beings don't like to acknowledge and think how influenced they are by their peers, because it's rather an uncomfortable concept. You like to think of yourself as an individual actor that's making your own decisions with a lot of free will, but the reality is we're enormously influenced by the people around us. And if people tell you something's okay, and you're all sitting in the bar together night after night, and it's all really scary out there, and we're in this together, and the people in head office just don't understand, and we've got to do what we've got to do. This is the kind of environment where I think you can lose your judgment and start to make corrupt decisions, or just ignore red flags. As we know, corruption can be as simple as ignoring a red flag and not taking action. This is not to excuse it. This is not to say it makes it okay. It's just more about understanding the realities of what actually happens and how people behave.
Well, is that elevated by another one of your chapters where you talk about urgency and necessity? And for a lot of viewers, they're working in public company environments, and those require quarterly reports, right? It's just by the regulators. So I think this is a really unaddressed issue in the compliance debate, and you elevated it quite well, where for a compliance and commercial team, what do you think this concentrated sense of urgency and necessity mean? And how can that be addressed in a public company environment where you have to have quarterly reports?
Yeah, there's been a bit of conversation recently about whether companies should be quarterly reporting, and I know Unilever abandoned it to very, very good effect. So, yeah, there is a sense that if you're always thinking short term, that is not a great incentive to tackle corruption when there are longer term things. I mean, a lot of the best practice advice on resisting corruption is actually about time. It's about buying time. It's about resisting the pressure to get this done now, whether that's a demand for a facilitation payment or a bigger bribe. If you can spend the time and put up with the delays, a lot of your corruption risk disappears. So the sense that we've got to get this done now, we've got to get the books closed by March, we've got to get this reported, this sense that we really have no choice, we've just got to do this as fast as possible, is another one of those things that's really, really dangerous when you're thinking about how humans really behave, and the way they're feeling and what they're likely to do as a result. So yeah, I think the short-term thing, and competition in general, I mean, people don't tend to talk about these things when they're talking about compliance systems, but that's where the problem is in terms of what actually happens.
Absolutely. And as I recently wrote in the FCPA blog, that's bribing not to lose.
Exactly.
That's when you're sitting there at the end of a quarter and it's a small amount of cash maybe standing between an employee and making bonus.
Exactly.
And that's where expediency, I think, really distorts whatever the ethics messages are and the anti-bribery compliance. I think expediency can just turn that on its head.
Yeah, and all of it. I mean, if you're just thinking as well about a pre-transaction due diligence, and the deal's got to get done, the lawyers are there, the finance people are there. There's a lot of incentives just to get this through, and your background check, your due diligence is holding up a huge amount of forward momentum. You've got to have a very, very strong case to stop that deal. Right. And so it puts an unfair pressure on the due diligence provider, the due diligence report, the findings, and so on. So I see this manifest itself in a ton of different ways, but time is a very often overlooked factor in corruption risk.
Well, there's a great, I guess, organizational theory or psychological theory, which is the loss aversion.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Bribing not to lose and taking greater risk not to lose.
Yeah, exactly. And just those sort of biases in risk-taking and decisions are, again, it's back to how people think and how people really behave. And I'd just like to see... I don't think it's a case necessarily that compliance systems need to factor this in, but company leadership needs to think a lot more broadly if they want to actually tackle corruption risk. It is unfair and inappropriate and doesn't really make any sense to stick the responsibility for that with the compliance department. This is not to downplay the vital role that compliance people play, but their role is about rule enforcement. It's about getting the deck chairs in a row. If the rules make no sense in the wider context, there's nothing that even the best compliance officer in the world can do.
And going back to your microcultures in these regions, that's where that bolt-on set of rules and procedures just might be viewed as a workaround.
Yeah, exactly.
At the field level.
Well, it's much less powerful. What the guy in head office says you ought to be doing in terms of paperwork versus the deal you've got to close, the phone calls you're getting, the pressure to make your targets, the day-to-day realities. I mean, there's no comparison in terms of how you're going to prioritize those issues.
Absolutely. So in conclusion, for someone who's new to this approach and concept, who just has stepped into a compliance organization, where would you have them start? In other words, what would you share with them as a takeaway as day one in their new role in this compliance organization?
Oh, I would get them to sit in a risk committee meeting and look at how decisions are made and how the different executives in the room think about risk. I would look at who has power, who interrupts who's really making the decisions, and I would tell them to look very, very hard at the context in which they're operating and to try to gather as much support and senior influence to really position compliance in within the wider values, ethics of the company, and think in those terms. And if they get the sense that compliance is a tick box performative thing and the rest of the company is just going to do what it's going to do, then that may not be the right job.
And this is sacrosanct for someone who was a former salesperson, but would you advise them to ring up human resources and say, can you share with me what some of the compensation plans are, and let's talk about incentives and comp plans in the context of anti-bribery compliance?
Yeah, I mean, I think the next big obvious place for the conversation to go is incentive structures, its rewards, its sales targets, it's what's appropriate for the market, and those sort of systems are a very, very, very good place to start. But for the compliance officer to be able to tackle that, there's got to be an acknowledgement within the company that that's a relevant conversation, and I don't think we're there yet.
Well, Alison, thank you very much for your time today. we've got plenty more to talk about, so we'll look forward to having you back.
I hope so. It was lovely to see you, Richard.
Same here. Thank you.